On March 31, 1984, just one day before his 45th birthday, the man whose voice defined a generation collapsed to his knees in his mother's bedroom. A single gunshot shattered the silence, and in an instant, one of music's most soulful icons was gone. But that bullet didn't set just into life. It ripped open decades of buried family turmoil, exposing secrets darker than anyone imagined. What happened in those last 24 hours? Why did a quiet room in a family home become the final stage for a legend's downfall? And were there signs long before that moment that everything was spiraling toward tragedy? Today, we peel back the layers of pain, fear, and unanswered questions. The truth behind this shocking death is about to unfold, slowly, painfully, and with revelations that may change everything you thought you knew. In truth, the bullet that ended Marvin Gaye's life was only the last page of a tragedy that had been burning beneath the surface for decades. During the final 24 hours of his life, the ghosts of his childhood came crawling back, pulling him toward a destiny he had never been able to outrun. On April 2, 1939, in Freedman's Hospital in Washington, D.C., the cry of a newborn broke the stillness of a cold white room. Outside, church bells chimed faintly through the morning air, as if foreshadowing a life that would shine brilliantly, yet be shadowed by relentless torment. The child was named Marvin Gaye Jr. In the cramped apartment at East Capitol Dwellings, peace was nothing more than a myth. His father, Reverend Marvin Gaye Sr., ruled the household with two weapons, scripture and a leather strap. Every Friday night, as darkness settled over the city, he lined up the children and forced them to read the Bible aloud, each verse treated like a test. One mispronounced word, one missed beat, and the belt would jingle before striking down with force. It wasn't just discipline, it was humiliation wrapped in God's name. Marvin's stepsister Jen later revealed, when he was 12, there wasn't set a spot on his body that wasn't set bruised. And Marvin himself admitted, "I lived in constant fear. I always knew there would be a next time." Music quickly became the only refuge in a home filled with terror. In 1943, at just 4 years old, Marvin sang solo in his father's church. His pure, angelic voice stunned the congregation into silence. For a brief moment, the sound of the strap disappeared, and even his mother's weary sighs seemed to fade. But that moment of salvation never lasted long. Behind the bedroom door lay another secret, one whispered through the neighborhood, one that carved a deep wound into Marvin's young mind. Reverend Gaye had a habit that few could speak of without lowering their voices. He wore women's clothing, nightgowns, silk blouses, high heels, nylon stockings, all belonging to his wife. His mother Alberta confirmed it. He liked soft fabrics. He wore my clothes. And Marvin saw it. The image seared itself into the boy's memory, becoming a silent torment he would battle for the rest of his life. Outside the home, the world showed no mercy either. Children in the neighborhood taunted him endlessly, twisting his surname into a weapon. They shouted "Gay." Each shout pierced him, slicing into his pride and planting seeds of insecurity that would grow like weeds. At Randall Junior High and later at Cardozo High School, Marvin learned how to hide his pain. He kept his head down on his desk, burying his face in his arms as students snickered behind him. Again and again, the word "gay" echoed through the hallways like a curse he could never escape. In those moments, Marvin wasn't a boy, he was a target. As he grew older, Marvin became consumed by a terrifying thought. Maybe something inside him really was flawed. Maybe the taunts meant something. Maybe the secret he saw in his father lived in him too. It was a fear he never dared to voice. By 1956, at 17, Marvin had reached his breaking point. He ran away from home by joining the U.S. Air Force. He told himself that military discipline, no matter how brutal, was easier to face than the unpredictable wrath of his father. But only months later, He was honorably discharged for disobedience. His escape collapsed almost instantly, and as he walked away from the base, he realized he still carried his father's shadow, a shadow that stretched all the way from Washington. So Marvin left with two things: his extraordinary voice and invisible wounds that would follow him into adulthood, into fame, and finally into tragedy. In January 1960, at age 21, Marvin arrived in Detroit. Harvey Fuqua had brought him to Motown, a small but rising empire. During his first session, when Marvin played the drums and then opened his mouth to sing, the room froze. Someone whispered, "That's Sips, the Prince of Motown." But the brighter he shone on stage, the darker his torment grew backstage. Under the lights, women screamed, reaching desperately for a piece of him. Yet the moment he stepped behind the curtains, the atmosphere changed. In the corridors of Hitsville, USA, a few musicians dragged out his last name, Gaye, laughing as they did. It transported Marvin back in time, straight to the hallways of Cardozo High. The same sting, the same shame, the same fear. Unable to take it anymore, Marvin quietly altered his identity. In 1961, as he prepared to release his first single, he added an E to his last name. Gaye became Gay. One letter, but to him it felt like a wall between the past and the future. He wanted to escape the whispers about his father, the taunts about his name, and the fear that he himself was different. But some walls cannot keep the past out. At Motown, rumors followed him like smoke. People whispered that Marvin never changed clothes in front of other men, as if he was terrified they might see something he didn't want exposed. On stage, he was magnetic, sensual, irresistible. Off stage, he was guarded, tense, constantly bracing for invisible accusations. These whispers didn't just rattle Marvin. They reminded him of the humiliation that had defined his childhood. They reignited his hatred toward the man who started it all, his father, the man in his mother's clothes. As Marvin's fame climbed, the echoes of his past grew louder. The fear, the insecurity, the trauma, none of it had vanished. It had only been buried beneath applause and bright lights. Then came a decision that Marvin hoped would silence every doubt about his masculinity and solidify his place in Motown's hierarchy: marriage. June 1963, Detroit. In a modest yet elegant ceremony, Marvin, just 24, stood in a white suit beside Anna Gordy, 17 years older and sister to the powerful Motown founder Berry Gordy. To the crowd, the marriage looked glamorous, even magical. A rising star marrying into Motown royalty. But close friends whispered another truth. This wasn't set just romance. For Marvin, it was armor, a strategic move to bury his insecurities, reshape his image, and prove to himself that he was everything the neighborhood kids said he wasn't. Everything his father tried to destroy. Everything he feared he lacked. But armor can crack. And Marvin's was already fractured by years of shame, fear, and emotional wounds that had never healed. Those scars, from the belt, from the taunts, from the secret he saw behind the bedroom door, were the shadows that would follow him for the rest of his life. Shadows that would eventually push him toward the final tragic confrontation in 1984. To Marvin, the marriage to Anna Gordy was more than love. It was a ladder, a polished doorway into the higher ranks of fame and power. But that climb came with a hidden price. By 1964, the news spread like wildfire. Marvin and Anna had welcomed a baby boy, Marvin Gaye III. The press celebrated the child as proof of a blissful marriage. Newspapers printed photos that painted them as Motown's royal couple. But the truth, whispered by friends and later confirmed by biographer David Ritz, was far more disturbing. The baby was not Anna Sip's child with Marvin. He was the son of Anna's teenage niece, 16-year-old Denise Gordy. Marvin knew the truth. He chose the lie anyway. He stood before cameras, held the infant lovingly, and let the world believe a fantasy because that fantasy held his carefully crafted image together. Yet another secret was now lodged inside his heart. Another weight pressing down on a man already fracturing. As Marvin's fame rose, the cracks inside him widened, and with the release of What's Going On May 21st, 1971, he became more than a star. He became a prophet of his generation. He sang about war, poverty, racial injustice. Audiences clung to every note. Critics bowed. Artists praised him loudly. But inside the Gaye household in Detroit, a different story unfolded. The marriage that had once looked glamorous was now rotting from within. Arguments broke out daily, about money, about jealousy, about the pressures of fame. Anna, the sister of Berry Gordy, began to take on a shape in Marvin's mind that terrified him. She reminded him more and more of the dominating figure he had fled from as a boy, his father. She was nurturing and caring at times, yet strict, sharp, unyielding. Marvin felt trapped in a maze of contradictions, as if reliving childhood in a new prison. Just when the emotional storm was reaching its peak, fate stepped in. In the fall of 1973, a young girl named Janice Hunter, only 17, walked into the studio where Marvin was recording. Her presence hit him like a forgotten memory. Her innocence, her softness, her wide eyes, they reminded Marvin of the version of himself he had lost somewhere along the path of trauma and fame. He fell into the affair recklessly, desperately, as though drowning and suddenly finding air. But passion quickly turned poisonous. Marvin loved Janice with an intensity that frightened even him. His fear of abandonment twisted that love into obsession. Jealousy gnawed at him. Paranoia guided his hands. At times he was sweetness incarnate, speaking so tenderly that Janice's friends said it could make anyone tremble. But moments later, a single look he didn't trust, a gesture he misread, could send him spiraling into rage. He could smash a whole room apart, one of her friends later said. Marvin was fighting demons Janice could not see, childhood nightmares, addictions, and a constant whisper inside him telling him he was unworthy of love. By the late 1970s, after years of infidelity, resentment, and emotional destruction, Marvin reached a bitter turning point. His marriage to Anna was collapsing in courtrooms now, not just behind closed doors. In December 1978, as the divorce neared its end, a judge ordered Marvin to pay Anna a staggering settlement, not with cash, but with royalties from his next album. It was a cruel slice of irony. The music he made would finance the end of his marriage. Marvin could have handed it over quietly, but silence was never his way. Instead, he crafted an album that served as a public autopsy of their relationship. Here, My Dear became his declaration. A musical document drenched in bitterness, anger, heartbreak, and confession. He sang about betrayal, disappointment, and deep wounds, theirs and his own. Every track felt like ripping open a scar. He exposed private moments, family secrets, and emotional ugliness. He believed it would end the chapter. Instead, he chained himself tighter to the pain, and the blows kept coming. By 1979, a darker threat loomed over his life: the government. Years of reckless spending and poor financial decisions had caught up with him. The IRS began sending letters colder than winter steel. Marvin ignored them at first, then feared them, then fled from them. By 1980, he owed more than $4.5 million. On March 23rd of that year, 2 IRS agents walked into his Hidden Hills mansion with authority so calm it was terrifying. They went room to room, tagging and removing valuables, his sound system, his beloved grand piano, even framed photos of him performing on stage. Marvin stood frozen in the corner, sweat dripping down his back. The spotlight that had once glorified him now burned him raw. His mansion didn't feel like a home anymore. It felt like a battlefield. And Marvin, once a towering figure of R&B, was now a man cornered, trembling, defeated. Before the agents could return with more orders, Marvin vanished. He packed a suitcase with a few demo tapes, some clothes, and disappeared into the California night. His escape led him to Hawaii. By summer of 1980, the man who had once worn tailored suits and stood on the greatest stages in America was now sleeping in a beat-up van parked along the beach. He curled on a thin mattress, listening to the ocean crash against the shore. During the day, he wandered beneath the palms, trying to wash away the taste of cocaine with ocean air. Friends who visited recalled him smoking constantly behind the wheel, drenched in sweat, his eyes dull and lost. The phone never stopped ringing. His lawyer warned the debt was growing. His manager begged him to return to performing. Janice demanded money. Marvin, drowning in fear, switched the phone off and pressed his forehead against the steering wheel. In his worn notebook, he wrote 2 words that summed up his world: no way out. When friends eventually tracked him down in Honolulu, they found a ghost. He was gaunt, unshaven, sunken, terrified. Nights plagued him with visions, his father, wearing a dress, standing silently at the foot of the bed. Marvin believed the ghosts were real. He believed they were coming for him. And then a name reached him from across the ocean. Freddie Cossert, a Belgian promoter with a reputation for saving lost artists, called him. "Come to Belgium," Freddie said. "No IRS, no drugs, just cold sea wind and peace." Marvin whispered that he couldn't afford the plane ticket. Freddie laughed softly. "Just get here. Everything else is on me." In February 1981, Marvin stepped off the plane in Belgium. The North Sea wind slapped his face like a wake-up call. Freddie drove him to a modest home and offered him the attic. No luxury, no pressure, just space to breathe. The first day, Marvin ran along the shoreline, coughing violently from lungs burned by cocaine. The first week, he shook through withdrawal, drenched in sweat. The second week, he slipped quietly into a local church, standing at the back while children sang hymns. By the third, he bought a TR-808 drum machine and began rebuilding himself through its pulsing beats. One humid afternoon in June 1981, writer David Ritz climbed up to Marvin's attic. He found magazines scattered everywhere, books, newspapers, and explicit content. Ritz looked Marvin in the eye and said, softly but firmly, "You don't need that. What you need is healing, sexual healing." The phrase struck Marvin like thunder. He sat at the piano, laid down slow chords, and layered the crisp metallic beats of the TR-808. His voice rose through the attic like smoke from a long extinguished fire. A new chapter began. By the summer of 1982, Marvin finished Midnight Love at Studio Katy outside Brussels. He programmed every drum hit himself, shaping each sound as if sealing away the ghosts of his past. For the first time in years, he sang without trembling. When Sexual Healing was released, the world roared with amazement. The song shot up the charts. And in February 1983, Marvin walked onto the Grammy stage to accept 2 awards, a triumphant moment that many believed marked his rebirth. He smiled, a real smile, something he had not done freely in years. But the light of a Grammy casts long shadows. When Marvin returned to Los Angeles, he embraced his mother and promised to stay clean. But it didn't take long before familiar knocks came at his door. Old dealers emerged from the darkness. And once again, the cycle of destruction quietly began. The relapse struck faster than anyone expected. On stage, Marvin's behavior spiraled beyond control. It wasn't sensual anymore, it was unraveling. During one show, while singing Let's Get It On, he ripped off his shirt, fumbled with his belt, and exposed not seduction, but suffering. Backstage, trembling, he leaned in close to his brother Frankie and whispered, "They supper coming for me. Walk with me. be the decoy. Frankie stared at him, horrified. He didn't laugh. He didn't question. He knew Marvin had crossed from fear into paranoia, and paranoia was pulling him under. Meanwhile, the IRS never stopped knocking. The debts, more than $4.5 million, grew like a beast with endless teeth. Bills, fines, foreclosure warnings stacked higher each week. Marvin Sitt's breath shortened. His shoulders slumped. And sometimes, in moments of bleak honesty, he said, "Maybe dying is the only way out. If I go, at least the insurance will take care of them." Friends brushed it off as dark humor. But Alberta, his mother, felt the chill in every word. She knew despair when she heard it. From here, my dear, to nights sleeping in a van, from shaking through cocaine withdrawal on a Belgian shore to winning Grammy Awards for sexual healing, Marvin's life had become a carousel of one agony replacing another. He paid for love with music, for taxes with his soul, and now convinced himself the only debt left to settle was his life. So he returned home. Returned to the one ghost he had never outrun, his father. In drawers of the upstairs bedroom, insurance papers lay tucked away, as if quietly waiting for tragedy to strike. Fall 1983, Los Angeles. Marvin Gaye walked back into the home at 21101 South Gramercy Place, the house he once bought proudly for his parents at the height of his fame. What had once felt like a victory, now felt like a tomb. The red bricks, the wide porch, the steps leading up, everything pulsed with memories he'd spent a lifetime trying to bury. Inside, the house seemed frozen in old shadows. Every wall felt hostile, whispering echoes of childhood, the snap of leather, his father's icy growl, the muffled crying of his mother in the next room. Marvin dropped his suitcase on the floor of his old bedroom. He didn't set unpack. He didn't set hang his suits. He wrapped himself in a gray bathrobe and barely removed it for months. Relatives later said he never went outside. He paced the house like someone waiting to be sentenced. Fear devoured him whole. He believed figures lurked outside the windows, waiting to kill him. He warned Frankie, "If a stranger comes to the door, don't bet the tea or hunting me." Every night, he clutched a pistol, flinching at the smallest creak on the porch. Upstairs, locked in his room, he paced back and forth, breath sharp, footsteps frantic, like an animal trapped in a cage. Paranoia, once creeping, now consumed him. Desperate to feel safe, Marvin filled the house with weapons, guns under pillows, in drawers, beneath cushions, and in a moment that would become the hinge between life and death, he pressed a Smith & Wesson .38 into his father, Sepp's hand, and whispered, "If they come for me, shoot them. Don Sepp, let them kill me." It was the cruelest twist of fate. Marvin, tormented his entire life by this man, now handing him the very weapon that could destroy him. Inside the house, tension grew thicker each day. By November 1983, Los Angeles nights turned cold, and so did the air within the Gramercy home. His father, Marvin Gaye Sr., drank heavily and fumed over the chaos, the strangers drifting in and out, the shouting matches echoing up the staircase, the scent of drugs clinging to furniture. "This is my house," he barked. "And I one set have this filth in here." Whenever the conflict exploded, Marvin ran to his mother's room, just as he had done as a terrified boy, hiding behind her while clinging to her robe. "Only you understand me," he muttered. "He sits hated me since the day I was born." In a notebook he kept beside his bed, he scribbled broken lines. "If I die, Mother, Don Set weep. At least my music lives. At least the insurance will save you." Years later, investigators would read those pages and shudder. This wasn't a man contemplating death, it was a man preparing for it. By late 1983, Marvin still performed the occasional show, but audiences barely recognized him. In Oakland, he tore off his shirt mid-song, ripped at his belt, eyes burning like fire, a man exposing his raw torment to thousands. A journalist wrote, Marvin sang as if he were peeling his own soul open on stage. Back home, the doors closed again. He smoked cocaine relentlessly. At night, Frankie heard him muttering, "They sutter going to kill me. If they don't set, father will. Mother, don't set, let him in." Alberta, caught between two men locked in lifelong war, was worn thin. She watched her son fade, thinner each day, eyes rimmed in red, hands trembling. She brewed tea, placed the cup outside his door, and stepped back. When Marvin opened it, she saw only a shell, a broken man teetering on a razor's edge. By early 1984, the house became a powder keg. One spark, one wrong breath, would ignite an irreversible explosion. On one side, the father, old, bitter, drunk, seething with frustration. On the other, the son, paranoid, unstable, armed, unraveling. In the middle stood Alberta, the final fragile thread holding the family together. What Marvin didn't realize was that the moment he handed his father that revolver months earlier, he had unknowingly lit the fuse. He had mistaken protection for surrender. Each night, he sat on his bedroom floor, back pressed against the wall, listening to the familiar shuffle of his father's slippers across the wooden hallway. To Marvin's fractured mind, those footsteps carried the same menace as the crack of a belt. He gripped his pistol tighter, sweat dripping down his temples. He remembered the words his father had repeated throughout his childhood. "I brought you into this world, and I can take you out." Now the phrase no longer sounded like anger. It sounded like prophecy. March 31st, 1984. The morning sky over Los Angeles was a dull gray, lifeless, heavy, as if the world itself sensed what was coming. Inside the house, another argument erupted. Scattered across the table were bills, IRS threats, foreclosure notices. His father, slurring, pointed at them and roared, "This is his mess. He sits destroying this family." Alberta snapped, trembling, "Don sit, you dare blame him. Without him, we wouldn't sit even have this house." Their shouting echoed through the ceiling. Upstairs, Marvin, hollow-eyed, robe clinging to his thin frame, stopped halfway down the staircase. He stepped into the living room. His chest rose and fell. He stared at his father. "Don't sit talk to her like that," he said quietly. "She doesn't sit deserve it." It was instead a scream. It was instead an outburst. It was steady, controlled. And it struck the old man like a slap. His father Sip's eyes widened in disbelief. Never in his life had Marvin spoken to him that way. The bottle in his hand quivered with anger. "Don't set you challenge me," he hissed. But the air had already shifted. Years of trauma, humiliation, beatings, and buried rage pulled themselves up from the depths. His father stepped toward Alberta, still shouting. And then the shock no one expected. Marvin moved, fast. Not defensive, not fearful. He charged. He lunged forward and struck his father square across the face, a full, fierce punch fueled by 40 years of pain. The old man stumbled backward, slamming into the wall. His eyes widened, stunned, wounded, enraged. He looked at his son as though seeing a stranger, as though seeing the impossible. For the first time in his entire life, Marvin Gaye had fought back. Gasps filled the house. Even Alberta froze. Frankie, returning from the kitchen, stopped dead in the doorway. No one could believe what they had just witnessed. Not from Marvin, not the gentle soul, not the peacemaker, not the man who always ran rather than raised a hand. The room trembled with the weight of that moment, and through gritted teeth, the old man whispered the same words he had hurled at his children for decades. "I brought you into this world, and I still take you out." The words slashed through the air like a blade. Marvin froze where he stood, chest heaving, eyes burning with a mix of fury and shame. For a brief second, he looked like the child he once was, cornered, helpless, wounded. Alberta rushed between them, gripping Marvin's trembling shoulders, but behind her panic was something even deeper, raw terror. She knew her husband's threat wasn't bluster anymore. It was a prophecy waiting to be fulfilled. The house fell silent after the explosion of voices, a heavy, suffocating silence. Marvin retreated to the only place that still held warmth, his mother's bedroom. He curled on her bed, his robe draped around him like a shroud. "Mother," he whispered, voice shredded, "if I die, at least you won't have to worry about the bills anymore." Alberta held his head against her chest, whispering, "Don't say that, you just need rest." But Marvin's words were not the ramblings of exhaustion. They sounded like a final testament. Then came the sound they both dreaded, the slow, dragging shuffle of slippers on the wooden hallway floor, a sound Marvin had grown up fearing, a sound that no longer belonged to a father but to a nightmare. Alberta lunged toward the door, but it swung open before she could touch the knob. Marvin Gaye Sr. stood there, dressed in a woman's nightgown, pale, sagging, wrong in every possible way, his thin legs squeezed into nylon stockings. And in his right hand was the Smith & Wesson .38, the very same gun Marvin himself had given him for protection. The image was grotesque, almost surreal, a living embodiment of every childhood fear Marvin had ever carried. Marvin clawed backward, gripping his mother's waist in pure animal panic. Alberta spread her arms wide, shielding him the way she had when he was small and bruised from beatings. Marvin screamed, voice cracking with a lifetime of trauma. "Do it. You has wanted to kill me all my life." Alberta sobbed. "Please, please, Don set. He sets our son." 2 gunshots shattered the moment. The first bullet ripped through Marvin's shoulder, ripping him from Alberta's arms and sending him crashing onto the floor. The second tore into his chest, tearing through lung and heart. He collapsed, eyes wide with shock, lips moving, only blood came out. Alberta dropped to her knees, gathering her son's limp body into her arms as crimson spread across her dress. Marvin Sr. didn't flee. He didn't cry. He simply stood there trembling, the gun still warm in his hand, his face eerily blank as though the act hadn't fully registered. It was 12:38 p.m., March 31st, 1984. Marvin Gaye, Prince of Motown, architect of soul, the voice who once asked the world what's going on, died in his mother's embrace one day before his 45th birthday. Not at the hands of an enemy, but by the man who had given him life, and suddenly the carefully buried shadows rose to the surface. The beatings, the humiliation, the confusion of watching his father dress in women's clothes, the failed escapes, the debts crushing his dignity, the cocaine that gnawed at his mind. All of it converged in a single bedroom where even a mother's love could not stop destiny. Alberta's wails ripped through the house, mixing with the sharp scent of gunpowder. Her cries were the funeral hymn for a son who had spent his life trying to answer a question the world adored, but one he could never solve for himself. News traveled instantly. Marvin Gaye murdered by his own father. Televisions flashed the headline. Radio hosts choked on the announcement. Fans clung to each other on sidewalks. Unable to process the horror, police arrived within minutes. Alberta's bedroom was no longer a sanctuary. It became a crime scene. Blood pooled across the floorboards. His father's nightgown smelled of whiskey and smoke. The gun lay on the bedspread like a final signature. Investigators found insurance documents neatly arranged in a drawer. The implication was chilling, as though the ending had been carefully anticipated. Both bullets had been fired at close range. Both came from the .38 Marvin had handed to his father months earlier. America staggered beneath the weight of the news. How could this happen? How could a man celebrated only a year earlier with 2 Grammys for sexual healing die not by fate or accident, but by family violence? Why did every thread, from childhood trauma to adult paranoia, point straight back to the same figure, his father? April 1st, 1984, the day Marvin should have celebrated turning 45, instead became a public mourning. Thousands gathered at Greater Grace Temple in Detroit. Some sobbed uncontrollably. Others stood in stunned silence. Motown greats Smokey Robinson, Stevie Wonder, Diana Ross placed hands on the closed casket and bowed their heads. But sorrow could not silence the questions. Why did he return to that house? Why arm the very man he feared most? Why speak so often of death as if preparing for it? In the days that followed, newspapers dissected his life. The New York Times, Rolling Stone, Los Angeles Times. They painted him as a genius torn apart by addiction, paranoia, debt, and unresolved childhood wounds. Friends shared chilling memories, Marvin wandering through the house in a bathrobe, clutching guns as though enemies lurked in every corner. Managers confirmed his belief that someone was always after him. Family members revealed his whispered confessions, his references to death as a way to protect them financially. In court, Marvin Sr. admitted what he had done. When asked why he pulled the trigger, he muttered three simple words: "He hit me," a feeble justification for patricide. He stood in court wearing ordinary clothes, but for the public, the haunting image of the nightgown remained forever attached to him. The charge, voluntary manslaughter. The sentence, 5 years of probation, but the verdict of history would weigh far heavier. He would forever be remembered as the man who killed the voice of Motown. For musicians, the loss was immeasurable. Stevie Wonder broke down at the funeral. Smokey Robinson whispered, "We sip lost a prophet." But beneath the tributes came another whisper, a darker suggestion. Had Marvin, consciously or not, orchestrated his own demise? The insurance folder, the journal entries about death, his whispered messages to his mother, his retreat to the house he feared, the gun he put into his father Sep's hand. To Black America, his death became a tragedy larger than any headline. Marvin had sung about war, chaos, injustice, but died from a different war, one inside a home shaped by violence, faith twisted into dominance, and wounds inherited across generations. His story turned into a mirror, reflecting families torn apart by silence, fear, repression, and shame. Years later, journalists still drive to Gramercy Place, stand outside the closed bedroom door, and whisper about the revolver, the notes, the prophecy fulfilled in a single horrifying moment. Marvin Set's legacy only grew stronger. What's Going On remains one of the most acclaimed albums ever made. Sexual Healing still vibrates with the warmth of redemption. But now, every time his songs play, they carry more than melody. They carry a farewell, a final cry from a man who tried to heal the world while bleeding inside. And so the death of Marvin Gaye is remembered not simply as a crime, but as a tragedy of Shakespearean proportions, where faith, trauma, shame, and love collided in one room. A room that was once his sanctuary, and became his tomb. And now the question is yours. Was Marvin Gaye's death a sudden moment of rage, or the heartbreaking result of years of inner turmoil? Were the insurance papers, the fear, and the decision to arm his father warning signs, or just tragic coincidences? Share your thoughts in the comments. We want to hear your perspective on this painful chapter in music history. Before you go, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. More untold stories of legendary artists are coming in the next video. Stay tuned.